Yes, share it on TikTok as well. Okay, great. So we are live. I got a message that we are live. Can we also check on our Facebook interwebs? Are we live on Facebook as well, comrades? I just want to make sure that for anyone who's watching on Facebook, let us know if you can see our red front cover or if you can see one of our organizers. We want to make sure that the Facebook Live event also is working. Great, it's working. Thank you. Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Good morning on the West Coast. Welcome to this event organized by Tempest Magazine. This is Biden Borders and the Fight for Migrant Rights. We have a good group of comrades from across the empire and south of the border who are joining us for this event. Today, our speakers will be Justin Akers Chacón. Justin is an educator and union activist in San Diego-Tijuana border region. He's member of the Puntorojo editorial collective and author of No One is Illegal with Mike Davis. He's also author of Radicals in the Barrio and the forthcoming book with Haymarket, The Border Crossed Us, the case for opening the US-Mexico border. So thank you, Justin, for joining us. We also have compañera from Free Them All, Tijuana, and anonymous Tejana, who will be giving an eyewitness account of the conditions of children being held in migrant detention prisons. So welcome, compañera. We also have Luis Rangel Rojas, a member of the Partido Revolucionario de las y los Trabajadores in Mexico. So he's coming to you from Mexico City. And we also have Ashley Smith, member of DSA in Burlington, Vermont, and a member of the Tempest Collective. He has written in numerous publications, including Spectre, Truth Out, Jacobin, and New Politics. What a great group of comrades. Thanks everyone for coming in and sharing with us your thoughts on these questions. I'm just gonna briefly introduce the subject and remind comrades we're doing this event because the Biden administration's policies have precipitated a humanitarian crisis on the border. And while Biden has repealed some of Trump's most vicious immigrant orders, the Biden administration has maintained a closed border and expelled over 170,000 people, has thrown 19,000 children into detention centers, and pressured Mexico to bar migrants from its southern border. So we believe that the Biden administration has basically betrayed the campaign promises and the immigrant rights movement that supported it and brought it into power. As Marxists, we believe that workers of all countries should unite and that organized workers have nothing to lose but their chains. And so that's the perspective we will be departing from for this event. Like I said, these are our group, our great roster of speakers coming in from Vermont, San Diego, Mexico City, and the Tijuana border region. I already introduced Justin, so I hope that comrades are on the lookout for his forthcoming book, The Border Crossed Us. And also our comrade Ashley Smith, who publishes regularly in New Politics, Spectre, and Spectre Journal as well. Luis Rojas and our compañera from Tijuana. I also want to thank our co-sponsors, Rampant Magazine, New Politics, and Puntorojo. So my name is Hector Agredano, and I will be moderating this event. Just so that comrades know, our platform for immigration rights is basically to abolish ICE, close the camps, full amnesty, and no borders. For anybody who wants to follow up on these, we will make these available. We also want to talk about Biden's deportation in his first 29 days, which stand at 26,248, and along with the number of deaths on the Mexico border and the amount spent on immigration enforcement as well. And we also want to highlight that the Biden administration has deported more Haitians than the Trump administration, right? And so there is a particular impact that this is having on Black communities. Okay, so let me just exit this. There we go. So we're gonna now move on to our speakers. Let me just work here through these Zoom buttons. Thank you, great. So our first speaker is going to be our compañera from Free Them All. Compañera, are you ready?
Yes, thank you.
All right,
Hi
go ahead.
everyone. So just to clarify, I'm actually not based at the border. So just to clarify that. And yeah, so thank you again for having me today. I will be sharing my experience working with children at one of these camps, actually, that was actually located in Dallas, Texas. But for framing, I first wanted to highlight that today marks the official beginning of the US-Mexico War in 1846. So why am I highlighting this? And this is something that this point that came from the zine educational project that I really wanted to emphasize, especially when we're talking about borders. Because the US conquest of Mexican territory as a result of the war would mark the second time that indigenous people and the lands of that region would be occupied by a foreign empire, first the Spanish and now the American Empire. This is one of the reasons that I really emphasize and I refer to myself as a Tejana because it's a reminder for many, we didn't cross the border crossed us. And I want to emphasize that the border and the entire immigration system upholds the settler, colonial, and white supremacist project through the enforcement of borders and by determining who is worthy enough to legally, right, in quotation marks, immigrate to the United States, even though that this project itself is founded on the murder, rape, and decimation of indigenous people. And my fight for migrant liberation is my own form of resistance against the white supremacist project. And then some of the points I wanted to emphasize when I'm, giving my account is the camps are not just at the border. And this is something that we really need to pay attention to. They're in places like Dallas, which is like North Texas, and places like Houston, Texas. And the children being held in these camps are more than a number or statistic. They each have their own stories and have made the journey that is often a very violent one to the US. The photo that I have here is drawn by a 7-year-old Ivana who drew a picture of herself inside a cage near the river. Her tia waits for her on the other side, standing next to an American flag. And so again, when we're also talking about it, there's also this emotional trauma that cannot be erased from children being held in cages. Secondly, there are private security firms that are making profits off caging these children and building this infrastructure. Finally, efforts should be directed at reunification and not building more cages for children. So in the beginning of March, I volunteered at the Kay Bailey Hutchinson Convention Center located in downtown Dallas. This is a large convention center, and basically there they were sending around at that point in the beginning of March was around 2,000 young boys, teenage boys between the ages of 14 to 17. And when I arrived, they are just being housed in this really large center, right? And they are dressed in gray, white, and navy blue sweatpants. And it really startled me because it looks so much like a jail in terms of just like what, just like the space that they were in. And also for me personally, how much they really reminded me and looked like my younger brother. And it was a very stark reminder of how differently my story would have been if my family didn't migrate. And the way it was set up is there were rows of cots lined in a grid system, which I would later find out that was how a boy would be located. So he was being located by his group number and cot number based on this grid system. So he became a letter and a number. And my role there was to locate youth in order for the volunteers to make calls to potential sponsors within the United States. And many of these young boys were coming from detention centers already at the border and had already been screened for potential sponsors. And the call center was staffed by a small number of volunteers. And I was, as I would walk around, I was just given a stack of papers and I was told to find these boys. And as I walked through the room, I was, met with very sad and hopeful eyes. I was met with faces that were just waiting for me and hoping that I would call their names. And, I would sort through the stack of papers and apologize because I didn't have their name and that they weren't able to make a phone call. Um, and and then among like some of these rows of cots, there would often be one missing. And I would later learn that these spaces were empty because of the boy being diagnosed with COVID. And so in this center, there was no space for social distancing whatsoever. And so testing would occur weekly. And if diagnosed positive, boys were moved off site. But when I asked like, where are these children being moved? They didn't tell me. I engaged in conversation with the boys while walking them over to the call center. The majority of them had made the journey from Guatemala. One boy I spoke to was very anxious because he had been at the center for 7 days already and had not made a single phone call. The call efforts were poorly organized in the beginning, and calls were only happening twice a week, before shifting to every day, which to me was really outrageous because you have 2,000 young boys and, who have potential sponsors in the US, but there weren't efforts to communicate with them. And the boys were only allowed to call their approved sponsor or their lawyer if they had one, and their consulate. They were not allowed to call back home and let their parents know that they arrived safely. And due to this anxiety of the uncertainty and of the overall process and delay, when one of the times I was there, 5 boys actually ran away. Like, they actually escaped from the center, and the whole entire center was placed on lockdown while these boys were being forced to return to their cots, and then they were just being counted over and over again. And it was 3 hours later where the 5 boys were actually located at a 7-Eleven convenience store. And this is just to emphasize that there's not enough caseworkers on staff, and they're completely understaffed. And I just learned recently, this past week, that they're going to be sending between 400 to 600 more young boys to the center. And while I was there, I noticed that the American Red Cross was transferring their operations to Coleman International, which is a private security firm. And it has just been awarded a $4 million contract by the Administration of Children and Families for emergency relief services for unaccompanied minors. And so why would a contract be given to this international security firm to work with children, right? And at the end of March, almost 19,000 migrant children were stopped at the border and currently in custody of the U.S. Health and Human Services, with an additional 2,853 children being held by U.S. Customs and Border Patrol. And so immigrant justice activists and advocates are demanding that there be faster reunification for children with family in the United States. In order for this to occur, there needs to be priority towards reunification and actually funding, or actually the money going to having these call centers built out, staffed with trained caseworkers and not simply volunteers, because all of this was being done by volunteers. Even some of the activities that they had for the children, none of this $4 million was going to developing a system really to reunite these boys. It was just to building more jails and more camps. Instead of awarding contracts to private security firms, there needs to be support that's given to organizations currently doing this work and supporting them with the priority of reunification of these children. And then also Detention Watch Network and several other human rights organizations are demanding that the Biden administration rescind Title 42, which basically was border closure, and fully restore access to asylum at the borders, including ports of entry, to ensure unaccompanied children have immediate and consistent access to legal counsel, and child advocates as well. So there is some push by immigrant and migrant justice organizations really calling on the Biden administration. And so with all this, I know we'll get more into the overall in terms of like Biden and everything, and we'll have some space for discussion, but I just really wanted to share that piece where it's just, again, all this money is going to creating these camps, and you have children there who haven't had contact with their family or with potential sponsors that they have in the US. And I just wanted to end that it is our duty to fight for liberation for these children and all detainees and deportees, and it is our duty to win. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that. Very needed and sobering insights from these facilities, compañera. Thank you. So our next speaker is Ashley Smith. Ashley is a DSA member in Burlington, Vermont, and he's also a writer at Spectre, New Politics, has contributed to Jacobin and other publications. Go ahead, Ashley.
Thanks, Hector. And I thank you to the comrade who just spoke, because I think it really demonstrates what a catastrophe Biden has caused, not only on the US-Mexico border, but in these detention camps. Under Trump, we would have called them cages, but somehow Biden is getting a pass. And this is so at odds with what Biden promised to migrants and their children when he was running for office. He has repealed a bunch of Trump's worst policies, but he has maintained Washington's brutal border regime. And really, this should surprise no one. We all remember that Biden was Obama's vice deporter in chief when they oversaw the largest number of deportations in the history of the United States during their 8 years in office together. And since he's come into office, Biden has not stopped deportations, which continue as usual. He's escalated expulsions, and he has maintained a closed border. And that closed border is directly responsible for this record number of expulsions that are going on. It is also responsible for family separation, which we decried under the Trump administration, but Biden is getting a pass for. What is happening is families get to the border and they let their kids go across, and then those kids get detained in the camps that our comrade was just describing. I think it is high time for the migrant justice movement and the left to come out full square, no apologies, in opposition to what Biden is doing on the US-Mexico border and throughout the United States, and not only in the United States, but how the US is using an imperial border regime to increasingly deter and deny the rights of migrants to come into the US and freely move throughout the world. Now, it is the case that all capitalist states have border regimes that they use to depress the value of migrant labor, and they use it to politically divide the working class between migrants and other workers within their borders. That is, as Frederick Douglass said, they divide both to conquer each. That is, this is a classic mechanism to lower the value of labor overall and to criminalize a super cheap labor force for the benefit of capital. The US forged its particular border regime through the history of settler colonialism, genocidal conquest of Native American land, imperial seizure of Mexican land, and then has policed this border regime ever since in a racist and xenophobic fashion to control the labor flows of migrants into the US. In the neoliberal period, the US opened the world economies to its multinationals and simultaneously built an empire of borders to police migration. So they opened the world to capital and increasingly monitored, policed, and blocked the migration of the world's people. And in this situation, I think it's very important to understand that far from being a victim of some so-called migrant crisis, the US is the main cause of the crisis of migration in our world today. And Biden has been an accomplice in most of the policies that the US has enacted that have caused the migration of people out of their homelands. He's been in government while the US has implemented policies that are directly responsible for global climate change, which is one of the key factors that is displacing people, in particular from Central America, where the severe storms that have been brought upon those countries, those storms have been made so severe by the patterns of global climate change. Biden has also supported all the neoliberal free trade deals that have wrecked Central America's economy, undermined Mexican economy, and all for the benefit of American corporations. And in so doing, when people lose their traditional forms of employment, be they as farmers or in traditional national capitalist corporations in their home countries, they lose their livelihoods and are forced to flee their countries in search of a better life, often coming to the United States. He's also supported all sorts of right-wing coups, in particular in Honduras, and a whole history of US imperial support for undemocratic repressive regimes in the region, which in the so-called Northern Triangle, which is the epicenter of a lot of the migration. And he's backed the construction of the border regime along the US-Mexico border and its internationalization to police the migration that the US has caused. That border regime ensures cheap, criminalized labor that comes into the United States for US corporations. And we know under the pandemic that how essential these workers are to the entire functioning of US capitalism. It's estimated that half of the 11 undocumented workers in the United States are actually essential workers. That is, we wouldn't have food on the table, we wouldn't have all sorts of services without the labor of this criminalized labor force that is criminalized precisely by the border regime that Biden helped constructed. Now, this bipartisan border regime really is responsible, one of the key factors for the rise of Trump and the right-wing nativism that has particularly gone after migrants in the United States. But this is also a global phenomenon because the attack on migrants is a part of the new right that's risen in reaction to neoliberalism, because as class inequality has become exacerbated and as small business owners, the petty bourgeoisie, have been thrown into crisis, right-wing figures have used xenophobic nationalism to target migrants as the source of the problem rather than the capitalist system itself. And Trump obviously came to fame by going after migrants in particular. It was the heart of his America First nationalism, and he really exploited the dynamics of anti-immigrant nativism that are the byproduct of the border regime that both parties have constructed. So if you want to find one of the key four reasons for the rise of Trump, it's the border regime that Biden helped construct. So Trump in power unleashed some of the worst features of American nativism that we've seen in the history of this country. Things like banning Muslims, the family separation, etc. But rather than bolstering the position of US capitalism and imperialism, Trump's regime undermined it. And this begins to explain what Biden's up to, in particular, that the left needs to be clear about. Biden came into office to implement a program of imperialist Keynesianism. His aim has been to rehabilitate US capitalism and strengthen US imperialism, in particular to compete with China. That includes getting rid of some of Trump's worst excesses, which were a stain on the reputation of the United States and the world system, and therefore compromised its ability to win hegemony among the different capitalist states that are in its traditional alliance structures. So that has meant that Biden has moved to get rid of some of the worst excesses of Trump's anti-immigrant policies. And what he's proposed to replace it is what is conventionally referred to as comprehensive immigration reform. So Biden has repealed many of Trump's worst excesses, like the Muslim ban, but his proposed comprehensive immigration reform is flawed and dead on arrival. Flawed in what sense? It includes an onerous path to citizenship that will exclude many, many people. It also includes border securitization, and including building a virtual wall based on high technology, and a neoliberal plan for the further opening up of Central America. This is absolutely no solution, and it doesn't even have support in Congress to make it through the legislative process. Meanwhile, Biden has continued to deport people as usual. Most horrifically, during Black History Month, he deported hundreds upon hundreds of Black Haitians to conditions of absolute political instability in Haiti. He's maintained the private detention system, and I think worst of all, maintained the closed border. And he has done so based on maintaining Trump's Title 42, which was designed and imposed on the CDC by none other than Stephen Miller, the arch racist, anti-immigrant bigot that was at the heart of Trump's nativist policies. And actually, it was imposed on the CDC against their wishes, and most public health officials oppose this. What Title 42 does is enable Biden to maintain the closed border based on the danger of the pandemic. Now, all of this is groundless because the US border is open to tourists going all over the world and into Central America and Latin America, but it's closed to migrants and closed to migrant workers moving across the border. In other words, it's a class-biased, racist, xenophobic policy that has no foundation in public health concerns. So Biden has closed the border, and this is what's caused the humanitarian crisis that we're witnessing. He expelled 170,000 people based on the closed border in March. He's expected to expel around 172,000 in April. He's got 19,000 kids that have been put in cages. And rather than help these people who are fleeing desperate conditions, he's actually moved to expand and internationalize the border regime even more. So he's launched a media campaign in Mexico and in Central America telling people they're not welcome, that they shouldn't come, that the border is closed. In other words, he is treating people as the problem and as part of the border regime. He's also enlisted Mexico, Guatemala, and Honduras to use their military and police to stop migrants from coming. And he's proposed an aid plan to Central America that backs the existing regimes, calls for neoliberal reforms, and increased border policings. So socialists should absolutely oppose what Biden is doing right now. And the migrant justice movement, like we're beginning to do on May Day, should get out on the streets and start protesting what Biden is doing and fight for our own program. We must demand that Biden let the migrants in. He should revoke Article 42 right now. We should call for Biden to stop all deportation. It's in his power to do that. We should agitate for Biden to free them all and reunite the families. And we must oppose Biden's expansion of the border regime. These are all immediate demands on the road to abolishing ICE and opening the borders of this country for the free movement of all people. Socialists must fight for a world without borders where no one is illegal.
Fantastic. Great closing, comrade. And yeah, I totally agree, right? These should be the positions and the arguments we should be advancing in the movement. And I just wanted to tell comrades we're going to be doing a few announcements at the end for any upcoming events on May Day. I also wanted to ask comrades to share on their social media, those comrades who are logging in from across the country, share on social media, invite your friends. I want to remind you that if anyone watching us on Facebook wants to be part of the discussion, we are only going to stream the presentations on Facebook. And if you want to be part of the discussion, you should sign up on the Zoom link that appears in the event description. And thanks to our speakers. I also want to introduce our next speaker, Luis Rangel, a comrade from the Workers' Revolutionary Party in Mexico, who's going to be talking about following up on what some of the things Ashley was mentioning. Are you ready, Luis? Go ahead.
Yeah, hello, everybody. Hope you can hear me. First of all, thank you so much for the invitation. And it's also a pleasure to see many of you, at least by this after many years. I'm going to share a small map for supporting what I'm going to say. This map was made by the comrades of Geocomunes. It's a solidarity geographic people that are involved in helping social movements. The original post is on the chat. And this is originally this research that Geocomunes make is about the megaprojectos that we are facing during the current government of López Obrador. And I wanted to bring it here because from our point of view, the role of the Mexican state, especially since the beginning of the 20th and century until now, is to be a stop of all the Central American migration reforms. And not only with, as Ashley said, with police and military, but also with facility infrastructures and etc. In this case, you can see here the el corredor transísmico, a whole project for connecting both oceans, the Pacific and the Atlantic, in order to help the US East Coast to get cheaper and faster all the commodities that are coming from China and so on. And actually, that's not a new project. since 1859, when President Juarez signed the McLean Ocampo treatment with the U.S. government. It was even the chance that what is today the Canal of Panama in Panama was built here in this region of Mexico that is known as the Istmo of Tehuantepec. So there's a long time history of historical and imperialist politics around this region for commerce and trade reasons. But recently it became also literally the wall, as Trump just said, for Central America, because here you have economic special zones, you have train, you have highways, you have extremely militarized and trade and trains going all the way down, so that stops the migrants, the migration flows. If you see the map, the purple dots are the main migrant routes ways from Central America to the north. And as you can see, it goes very close to the different projects, and also especially the one that goes through the Gulf of Mexico. It's also one of the main and traditional drugs ways for getting here. So we have three phenomena going here together. In one hand, all these mega proyectos and long-term imperialist projects in this in our southern border. Sorry, we have in a second place the main migrant ways routes, and in the third place we have, it's not in this map, but it's quite a similar phenomenon, the drug cartels ways. So these three issues get together, and I'm going to stop this so I can see my notes, but you can look out for the original map and the main research of the communities. So what I wanted to say after this brief introduction is that if we want to analyze the Biden's migrant policy and their relationship with the Mexican one, first of all, we need to take in account that our political cycle is not at the same rhythm that the US cycle. Yeah, sure. And we have our national presidential elections in 2018, and López Obrador period will end until 2024. So López Obrador government entered with Trump's administration, and now it will end with Biden's. So from that point of view, I think it could be useful to compare how López Obrador policy was around the migrant issue in terms of the Central American migration, but also in terms of the Mexican communities and Mexican migrants in the US when Trump was in office and after that. And now, from our point of view, what actually happened is that in the migration issue was used as a bargaining chip for the nationalist interest of López Obrador. And just a small note, when we talk about nationalism, is not, as I think in the US, immediately referred to extreme right neo-fascist issue. In Mexico and mostly in Latin America, when we talk about nationalism, it's not just exactly that. It could be also governments that want to promote national rooted economic development for Mexican people in this case, for Mexican people in the Mexican territory. So for López Obrador's nationalist interest, he wanted to keep calm with Donald Trump. He wanted to use to save the NAFTA in second place, and all this especially around the NAFTA negotiations, as you may remember. At the same time, one of the first migrant caravans were crossing through Mexican territory. And by the way, from our point of view, the caravans are a very important phenomenon, because when individual migrants or small groups of migrants go through Mexico territory, they face the narco and the organized crime terror. And when they go organized with public, with media, etc., they can find the police or the border patrol at the end of the way, but they can go more or less with more safety through Mexican territory. So at the same time, when the caravans were going through Mexico City or through Mexico territory, NAFTA negotiations were in place, and Trump, as you remember, he threatened Mexico to get out of the treatment. So López Obrador used the police, used the army to stop the caravans. Thank you, Hector. To do it. Okay, I'm going to be more quickly. So after Trump's administration, the expectations of the Mexican right was to face an Biden-AMLO confrontation. From our point of view, that will not be the case. We think that López Obrador has this kind of nationalist project where migrations and Mexicans outside our territory can be a bargain chip, but also we have, and we need to be clear and conscious about that, a lack of sovereignty. Our government, even if we had the best left-wing socialist government, we had a lack of sovereignty because we are facing the fucking U.S. empire. So that make more complex that these things. Just for ending, three general reflections. In one case, it's very important for the left and the social movements here in Mexico to get more involved in supporting the migrant issue. It's quite common that just in the border cities, there are strong social movements that organize and make solidarity, etc. But in Mexico City, in many other, Guadalajara, in many other places in the country where migration is not an everyday issue, the left wing and trade unions, etc., are involved in other agenda. Besides, there are very important experiences as the patronas that help with food, migrants in the south, etc. But also because we need to denounce and stop as far as we can the barbaric conditions that we go through, that migrants community go through Mexico City. You can go on Google, for example, the case of Camargo, Tamaulipas in January 2021, where 19 migrants from Guatemala were murdered and burned in our northern border in Tamaulipas, near Texas border. And that case opened a complex corruption and collaboration scheme between the drug dealers, the organized crime, the state, the police, etc. And that's the deepest problem for us. And finally, for you, we think that at the end, for Mexican social movement left, we must go and fight against that, and also, of course, denounce the cases and the detention centers in the US, because if we look the whole picture, we will have that the migrants from Central America go across this hell all the way in Mexican territory just for ending in the detention centers. You know, I mean, it's not that, okay, you go all through all this and maybe you are safe, you have some dignity at the other side. That's not, but we cannot have any expectations that López Obrador government will take any strong position around the migrant issue. Will be just following general orders from the U.S. empire, no matter who is in office. And thank you again.
Great. Thank you for that, Luis. Also very sobering description of what's going on in Mexico and the role of Mexico. Our next speaker is Justin Akers Chacón. compañero of Puntorojo magazine, and he's joining us from the San Diego-Tijuana border region. Justin, you ready? Go ahead.
Yes, thank you. Good morning, compas, compañeros, compañeras. I'm going to talk a little bit about the political economy of bordered capitalism and connect some of the threads that have already been mentioned. Thanks for the excellent presentations and informative presentations. So I want to talk about specifically the North American capitalist model that we're sort of looking at here in terms of how U.S. capitalism has now sort of functions as a region. There's been a regional transnationalization of commodity circulation, production, and financialization with U.S. capital at the center of that. And this, sort of contextualizes how we can begin to see the specific characteristics of how migration, how the economies are integrated, how people are displaced, migration functions, and how this all fits into how capital accumulation, has been structured in the last, especially 3 decades, but accelerated under the conditions of economic crisis. So through the aegis of free trade agreements, now there are, many different variety of techniques for opening borders for capital export. The U.S. capital has extended production chains across the region, and further consumed whole public and privatized industries across Mexico, the Caribbean, and Central America. Has engaged in, as people have already talked about, mega extractivist projects, has essentially displaced or partnered with national capital, and is vying or partnering or vying with foreign capital. But the culmination is that U.S. capital has implanted itself in the region on a scale that I greater than it was on the eve of the Mexican Revolution in terms of U.S. capital concentration. But on the other hand, this has also created a kind of regionalized proletariat chain, linking workers across these borders in different ways. So in one way, inside the United States, we have, especially over the last 3 decades, significant transfers of immigrant workers, right, from Mexico first, especially, and then Central America and the Caribbean. So we have immigrant workers that have been living in the United States now over the course of 3 decades. We have migrant refugee workers who are basically displaced and in the process of moving across borders. And then we have captive workers. So borders are designed to not stop the flow of workers, but to contain population of workers who now are sort of nestled in the production chains inside these nations. Disproportionately women and older workers who have less mobility, less means of navigating migration. And so, essentially, over the last 3 decades, we now can say that many workers in the U.S. and across this region have the same bosses. The bankers that extract our wealth through our debt and other forms here are the same bankers that are doing that in Mexico, the same bankers that are doing it in Guatemala. The same investor groups are operating to extract our surplus value across borders. The same multinational corporations are in operation, et cetera. So over the last 3 decades, this reorganization of capital has been carried out through the aegis of the state to restructure the capital accumulation. Of course, starting with the crisis of neoliberal crisis of capitalism, and extending through free trade, smashing of unions, the suppression of wages, the tiering of production, all of the reforms, reorganization of capital in the United States, and then this is extended internationally through the nodes of regional transnationalization. I guess my a point I really want to emphasize here is the role of the state process. So, and I refer to this as the migra state. I'm not sure what this is doing that. The migra state is the sort of growing apparatus of the state specifically directed towards this form of capital accumulation. Starting in the 1970s, the beginning of deindustrialization, the breaking of unions coincides with another sort of phenomena on the US-Mexican border, which is the beginnings of the Mexican national capitalist model of industrialization. And of course, this was aided in large part by US opposition to Mexican autonomous economic development. This has always tried to find the Mexican development because it would prefer to keep it a repository of natural resources and exploitable labor. But the model of capitalist development under post-revolutionary Mexico itself had its own limitations and failings. So essentially that model's failure contributed to the beginning of outmigration, especially in the debt crises of the 70s that extended all the way through the 80s. And we began to see a transition in the United States away from sort of guest worker model, has various names. Bracero is the main one, but there's been various manifestations of this towards the preference for undocumented workers. Get more into why undocumented workers have so much embedded value, but one of the most immediate values for capital, and that they began to recognize in the 70s, really in the 60s, transitioning from the bracero into the 70s was the large population of these workers, the fact that capital did not have to invest in their maintenance or reproduction. Workers provided their means of crossing the border. And essentially, capital saw this as a means to structure labor markets. Whole industries in the US, manufacturing, food industries, construction, service sectors, essentially migrants replaced children of blue collar workers who moved to other industries, moved to larger cities, or if they had the opportunity to get a college education, they moved into the professions. And in the late 1970s, there was talk of an amnesty, essentially creating the condition where these workers could be legalized, because the idea was that first generation migrant across the border who were legalized would essentially become lifelong workers. So their labor, they could be counted on to work in one job or one industry over the course of their lifetime, and that would be a source of continuous surplus value. But many Mexican workers, for instance, in the 70s and 80s, did have experience with unionization. They did have experience with organization. And when they moved into, starting in the late 1970s, especially many of these migrant workers did not see themselves essentially as they did not see that they were just going to be, let me rephrase this. They engaged like other workers in wanting to negotiate better conditions and wages. And one of the ways of doing that was, even without documentation, was simply changing jobs. So for instance, in the carpet industry in places like Georgia, would go into these carpet mills, and then if they didn't like it, they would quit and they would go down the street and work in another mill. This was a way that it commonly operated. So the practice of mobility actually made it difficult for capital to keep them in their positions. So I got to move forward here. So essentially, we see amnesty happen in 1986, and this created a massive surge of workers into unions. And so this was in the second half of, especially after the 1970s, this was the greatest significant surge of unionization in the United States was through the amnesty. And so this idea that work mobility and this also attracted the attention of unions. So starting in the 1970s, unions begin to break away and begin to focus on organizing these workers into unions. And so this shifted a lot of the discourse around immigration. Between 1976 and 1983, various state agencies, think tanks, the U.S. Naval College, a number of sort of state and parastatal agencies begin to talk about the need to contain the border, seeing migration as a destabilizing force, and introducing the sort of reactionary populism of the need to protect U.S. jobs from migrant workers. Okay, okay, two more parts. So immigrant, migrant, and these contained workers have always been at the head of the sort of struggle. U.S. workers on the question of the need for there to be solidarity and joining in common unions. This was also expressed in 2003 with immigrant worker freedom rides, which were largely organized through unions, but by immigrant workers, culminated in May 1st, 2006 in the call for another amnesty. And, you know, several million workers came out, led by the workers themselves through the integral organizations of immigrant workers, but with the resources of unions. And it produced a very significant shift in discourse in this country. And this movement positioned itself as the next wave of unionization, legalization. But between 2006 and 2007, the U.S. state smashed that cellular organization of immigrant workers through raids, workplace raids, deportations, the expansion of ICE, the interiorization of ICE. All of this was essentially, a clamping down of that kind of worker-led organizing, and it shifted the center of struggle. The atomization and smashing of that movement shifted the center of struggle to nonprofits and NGOs, and which struggle is a generous word. The focus was now through electoral means rather than mass action. And then furthermore, the U.S., starting in 2006-7, and then extending all the way to the present, the U.S. The silence of aggression shifted towards militarization of the region. In Merida, the partnering with the Mexican state, Felipe Calderon, to launch quote-unquote war on drugs, the containment of Venezuela, the overthrowing of Zelaya and Honduras, a number of other sort of factors that are essentially creating the securitization, the militarization of the region that sets that coincides with the bordering of the U.S. Mexico. I have to wrap up here. There's a few things I wanted to talk about, but I'll just emphasize that even with level of repression, we do see worker struggle developing through the nodes of this transnationalization. So between 2013 and 2020, there were transnational worker strikes, including a strike in 2015 in Baja California below the San Diego, involved over 25,000 migrant workers, many indigenous workers from South Mexico. There were 45 wildcat strikes across Maquiladora, primarily concentrated in U.S. companies on the Mexican border. There were general strikes more recently in Haiti and Honduras against U.S.-backed regimes. And in the U.S., we've seen the beginnings of forms of non-linear opposition to the border wall, including during the budget showdown of 2018, when flight attendants, led by the Association of Flight Attendants, CWA, within the AFA, waged a campaign to stop deportations, getting airlines to refuse to collaborate with the Trump administration, and even threatening to go on general strike to oppose Trump's budget that included funding for the border wall, which ended sort of expansion of the border wall. There's a lot more examples, but I'll just conclude by saying that this movement, not only these movements have surged and they have pressed. The state, on the one hand, played a significant role of repressing, transnational movements, immigrant rights movements, but our political system as well. Biden, as Ashley talked about, is an unreconstructed border militarist. Bernie Sanders and the squad and progressives, while have tailed the movement of 2019 and essentially played the historic role of tailing popular movements, but then co-opted and channeled those movements back to electoral campaigns, which have turned out to be dead ends. They prioritize bailing out capital, infrastructure, their infrastructure plan, and other projects are essentially capitalism. And now that they're at power, they're in charge of the migrant state and have effectively abandoned reform altogether, and are already positioning themselves for a right turn. And this is my last point. And because of this, the Republicans who have been demolished in previous episodes of the immigrant rights struggle, at the in 2006, 2008, for instance, are now being rehabilitated, especially the far right wing of it are being rehabilitated. The inability, incapacity, and willingness of the Democrats to actually push any meaningful reform. So we're already seeing the America's First Caucus. We're already seeing reorganization of the build the wall sort of rhetoric within the Republican Party. We're going to see new manifestations of the Minutemen and the Tea Party, et cetera. So we have to basically rebuild a movement or contribute to building a movement that is centered around abolitionism, that unites with forces and the methods of the Black Lives Matter movement, and ties the struggle to the need for revolutionary transformation. In the next year, we're going to see the far right return to the streets. We're going to see immigrant workers. We're going to see other manifestations of the left express themselves in the streets. We have out there and locked on the arm. We have to be very clear and delineate a revolutionary internationalism that is essential for rebuilding the kind of movement that's going to open the border. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Justin. And I also want to share Justin's article, which appeared on Puntorojo magazine earlier in the month, and for which we are borrowing the focus of this talk as well, on Biden's immigration proposals. I really encourage comrades to read it. It is Justin really laid out a thorough argument to understand the border and immigration as an imperial strategy of the United States. And Justin and other comrades, I think, also pointed out the importance of the state as being the enforcer of these ruling class interests, and which the question of the state, as some others probably agree with me, right, is a weakness of the US left at the moment. In any case, I want to remind comrades who are watching us on Facebook that we are going to move into the discussion section. And if you want to be part of the discussion, use the Zoom link to register for the discussion part, which is going to happen only on Zoom. This is going to be the end of our transmission on Facebook. And we're going to be transitioning to the discussion portion. I also want to remind comrades that as we move into the discussion section, I'm going to be moderating. I'm going to be asking people to get on Stack by typing their name in the chat. And then I'm going to be applying a progressive stack, trying to get comrades who don't speak often or coming from other locations as well. I will limit the contributions to 3 minutes so that we can get a few